All right, so we are going to talk about in the fourth section what China is like today. And this is going to tie in much of the information that you guys were looking at and we were discussing with the current event activity that we did. So now we're going to kind of just summarize this and hit on what are the key important points that we should make. So in our notes for EQ1, looking at what Chinese society is like today, well, we want to start by talking about their population. So for the first bullet, we want to say China today has a population. China today has a population of 1.37 billion people. 1.37 billion people, making it the most populated country in the world. Making it the most populated country in the world, semicolon. So China's the largest population in the world. Second would be India. And so because of this huge population that they have, back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, they established what you were reading about with one of the current events, which was the one-child policy. So we want to say, after the semicolon, due to their large society, China has tried to limit population growth. China has tried to limit population growth by using the one-child policy. By using the one-child policy, which limits couples to having only one child. And then in parentheses, I would put something about like preferably a male. And so we talked about yesterday how this has caused a lot of, issues within their society, and we see, like huge orphanages filled with little girls, and then the fact that now, because of the working generation being smaller, that has caused issues when it comes to industrialization in their economy, as well as having this aging population. So after what we just wrote, put a semicolon, we want to say this has caused the issue of having an aging population that cannot sustain the economy and industrialization. So that is one of the major issues that we see in Chinese society today because of the one-child policy. Another issue that we were talking about is urbanization. So for the second bullet, I want you to write urbanization, which is up on the screen if you need a spell check, is rapidly occurring in China, with many people moving from farming villages to the cities along the eastern coast, due to forced migration or to find better paying work. Semicolon. So that was another issue we talked about, that we see more and more people moving towards these cities, towards these industrial centers, either to find more jobs or because the government wants to, eradicate some of these farming villages. And so as a result, that change has impacted other areas, specifically in the idea of now we see wealth very kind of all over the place, uneven within their society, and also the fact that there's major issues with air pollution in a lot of these cities. And we talked about yesterday that issue and how, even the Beijing Olympics almost didn't happen because of the high amount of air pollution. So after work, put a semicolon, we would say, as a result, this has caused issues. As a result, this has caused issues such as an uneven distribution of wealth, and serious air pollution around cities. So we can see some of the ripple effects there of that situation. All right, third thing we want to note. Chinese society is on the cutting edge. Chinese society is on the cutting edge of science, medicine, and technology, which has made it one of the largest economic players in this century. Semicolon. So we see that China is vastly growing in technology, looking at green energy, looking at being more efficient, like the high-powered trains I talked to you about, robotics. So they are vastly growing in these areas and becoming a major global competitor, especially of countries like our own here in the United States. So with that, one of the reasons why we think that they are, so good at producing these types of, new innovations and ideas is because of the rigor of their educational system. So put a semicolon, and we want to say many feel this is due to the rigorous educational system. This is due to the rigorous, rigorous, educational system that uses a form of standardized tests, to separate the elite from their society. And so we talked about how their educational system is incredibly challenging and rigorous, and the tests that they take puts a lot of pressure and high expectations. And so that's why we see this large influx of people from Asia coming to the United States and getting a great education at some of the top schools in our country, and then going back to China and using that knowledge to benefit Chinese society. And so they are a major world competitor, and a lot of people believe it's because of that system of education that they have. But then the converse of that is that those that don't do well on this test are forced to work in very menial, monotonous jobs. So for the next bullet, we want to say those that are unsuccessful on these tests, are forced to work undesirable jobs in Chinese factories. And then put a semicolon, and we want to say China has experienced criticism. China has experienced criticism for the poor working conditions, and treatment of workers in these factories. Poor working conditions and treatment of workers in these factories. So oftentimes when these young people work in these factories, in some of these factories, they have very, very terrible working conditions where they work extremely long hours, that they, very much get little time for themselves. There's very little breaks, that a lot of times these factories are part of what are called factory cities, that literally it's an entire community that's built around working in the factory, and that people live within this little facility, and it just changes the dynamics. And if you think about China, they have this huge industrialized society. Think of how many products have the Made in China stamp on the back, and they are able to produce things at incredibly rapid rates. And that's because of how they design these factories. But the working conditions for workers have really come under fire, and some of the biggest ones, there's this factory called Foxconn, and Foxconn makes the technology that goes in iPhones, and they've gotten a lot of heat for how they treat their workers. And like I said, the people live there in like these little bunks, and it's just a really interesting lifestyle. And what they found is that at this Foxconn factory specifically, that people were, because of the lifestyle they were living and kind of what was going on, that they would try and commit suicide and would go up to the roof of the factory and jump off. And so just because of the poor conditions and things like that. And so the Foxconn company, in order to solve their problem, instead of, looking at psychology or maybe revamping their factories to make conditions better for their workers, they ended up just putting nets up to catch people that would try and jump off of the roof. So it's really just kind of ridiculous, the working conditions, but they're all about productivity and efficiency and making those products. And it doesn't really matter if they lose people in the process. So it's really kind of crazy. And we can maybe see some connections back to Xi Hongdi and his Great Wall of China. The last thing we want to note about Chinese society is we want to talk about how the West has greatly influenced China and its Eastern culture. So we want to say, for the last bullet, the West has had great influence. The West has had great influence on Chinese culture. And then I want you to put like a little comment and say, and vice versa, because it goes both ways. And vice versa. And then put a comma, and we want to say, due to the modernization of their society. Due to the modernization of their society. And then put a semicolon. And we want to say, many of their TV shows, comma, fashion trends, comma, and food choices. Mimic Western culture. So we do see some similarities as we've had some cultural diffusion and some impact on Chinese society. Like there are McDonald's in China, that a lot of the fashion trends that they wear are similar to what's going on even within our own country. That we see television shows that are modeled. If you look at the picture up there in the bottom right, that is a show that is modeled after our American television show Friends, that's supposed to kind of play on those same type of ideas and characters. So we see a lot of kind of similarities, and that Chinese culture has even left its mark here in our country as well. So because of cultural diffusion and things like that. All right, so the second EQ is what Chinese communism is like today. So for the first bullet, we want to say after Mao's death, there was a struggle over leadership. There was a struggle over leadership with some wanting to model China, after the Soviet Union, and some wanting to have a more capitalist, market-based, which is hyphenated, economy, a more capitalist, market-based economy. So after Mao's death, China started to kind of question where communism was going to go, because if you remember, we talked about how Mao was very much the face of communism in China. And so once he's gone, then the question is, how are they going to progress? And we kind of see some division here, some wanting more, to continue what Mao was doing, some wanting to maybe expand more and become more capitalist at a time where, especially in the 70s and the 80s, that was really a time of a lot of growth and capitalism here in the world. So one of kind of the heads of this event, where we see this divide between these two sides of thought, is in 1989 with an event called the Tiananmen Square Massacre. So for the second bullet, I want you to write, in 1989, the Tiananmen Square Massacre, it's up there on the screen for you. The Tiananmen Square Massacre. And we want to say in Beijing, B-E-I-J-I-N-G, showed a divide between those who wanted to strictly enforce communist policies, and those that wanted to see economic and political reforms. Semicolon. So this is an event that kind of encompasses this divide between people that were still solid in going with the communist ideals, and then those that wanted to maybe evolve or change their society a little bit more to fit with the times, those that maybe were interested in democracy a little bit more. In the current event that some of you looked at, looking at the democratic fight, that there are many right now that are, again, pushing for democracy. There's always kind of been this divide, this pull between communism and democracy, especially in more modern China after Mao's death. So this event of the Tiananmen Square Massacre occurred because of this divide between these two sides. So put a semicolon after reforms, and we want to say the Chinese government attempted to shield the events of the massacre from the global community, but were unsuccessful and powerful images like the tank man like the tank man, which is the picture there in the bottom left corner, flooded the news. So the Tiananmen Square massacre started out as just a peaceful protest. If you look at the picture up at the top, where people were gathering within Tiananmen Square, which is a big place within Beijing that the government is located, and we're just trying to protest and kind of voice their concerns and their, that they wanted reform and changes within society. And the government decided that they needed to kind of put down this threat. And so there were soldiers that were brought out and they opened fire on the crowd, and it kind of just unfolded in this very violent event. And there was lots of loss of life, like the picture down in the bottom right. And this image of the tank man was something that was all over the news in across the United States, Europe, and people from the Western perspective looked at that and felt that, maybe this is something where China does need to reform. And because of that, China very much had to kind of, if they wanted to still remain as a global player, needed to make some changes. So we did start to see some small changes and some more freedoms and some more movement towards capitalist society, but China still very much holds on to its, communist manifesto and the things that it believes. So a really kind of interesting event there. And then one of the other examples or things that fits with communist China today was what we were talking about with internet censorship. So for the third bullet, we want to say internet censorship has been a major issue in Chinese society. And then put a semicolon. We want to say the Chinese government blocks approximately 18,000 websites. Chinese government blocks approximately 18,000 websites, including 12 of the top 100, most visited global sites. So they very much try and restrict what those that go on the internet can see. And what's interesting, if you look at that little chart up there at the top, it says 340 million internet users in China. The world's largest internet population is the world's most heavily watched. And then 1/4 of China's total population uses the internet. So only actually a fraction of their country have actual access to the internet. But the number looks huge because of China's population being so large. So if you think about it, that really is a small portion. 25% of all people in China are using the internet. And then the sites that they do access, many of the big, sites that you guys use are blocked over in China. And so after sites, put a semicolon, and we want to say many of these sites are ones that address political topics or global news sources, comma, social media, comma, or discussion boards, and then put a semicolon. And we want to say, while some of the restrictions have lessened, as meaning become less, have lessened in the past few years, many still feel restricted by the government. by the government. So they have, lessened many of the restrictions, but there's still a lot of sites that they're not allowed to use or cannot access. And so because of that, that has, kind of limited their exposure to information. We talked about the types of sites that they target, a lot of like social media, anything that provides more global news perspectives and discussion boards, things like that, where they can access more outside, broader ideas. So those are the kinds of things they target. All right, our last EQ is about how China interacts with other parts of the world. So for the first bullet, we want to say China's goal in working with other countries, is, and then the quote up there in the left, is to maintain world peace and propel common development. Maintain world peace and propel common development. So that is kind of the staple of what their goal is moving forward as a country. So they want to promote peace and interact peacefully with other countries, and they want to propel common development. So push for industry, push for, technology, innovation, and find ways that they can mutually benefit other countries, both in Asia as well as throughout the world. For our second thing that we want to note is that China, so this is the second bullet, China has a permanent seat. China has a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. On the United Nations Security Council, which means that China is responsible for ensuring international peace and security. Ensuring international peace and security. So China, because of their position on the UN Security Council, which is a very important committee within the UN, they are one of the big proponents for working towards promoting peace, promoting security, all that kind of stuff. Now, China is also a country that possesses nuclear arms, and so they have, there's been a lot of talks about nuclear disarmament, but kind of the attitude is that if they're going to possess that, then the idea is they're doing it solely for peaceful processes. Now, whether having nuclear arms promotes peace, that's a question for another day, but this idea is at least addressing that, the UN Security Council, China will always have a seat on that committee because of their role as a global player. One of China's biggest kind of allies, especially economically, is India. And we talked about how China and India both have very rigorous educational systems and also are very important in, natural resources and technology and innovation. So for the third bullet, we want to say China and India have been working together. China and India have been working together to mutually improve both nations' economies. So that's been a big push, and we'll talk about how that has benefited both countries a little bit later, but they are definitely becoming economic powers in both China and India. And then the last thing we want to talk about is China's relationship with Taiwan and Tibet. So we want to say after years of conflict and tension, Taiwan and Tibet continue to fight for independence. From China. Then we're going to say China does not recognize them as legitimate nations. But rather as parts of China. And then put a semicolon. And we want to say many public protests have occurred to draw international attention to this issue of sovereignty. SOVEREIGNTY. So China, all that time ago, back during the Qing dynasty, took control of Taiwan and Tibet. And those regions, ever since then, have been trying to fight for independence and want to be relinquished from being under kind of China's empire, so to speak. And Taiwan there's been many people within that region that have been fighting and trying to rebel, that they want a more democratic society there, and they're tired of being under this communist Chinese reign. And then Tibet, which is one of the regions that is dominantly Buddhist, believes that communism and the type of government that they have is just totally not fitting with what they feel in that region, and that they want basically sovereignty and to be able to become like an independent Buddhist state. And there have been a lot of political protests on both sides, but one of the most shocking has been by Buddhist Tibetan monks, which have gone out and protested. And one of the ways that they do that is that they meditate, and then prior or while they are meditating, they will douse themselves in gasoline and light themselves on fire to make this statement that basically they would rather like kind of die and release themselves from human form than be under China's reign. And it's been very shocking and got a lot of public attention. But this has been something that has been brought up over and over again, that China needs to maybe look at its control of Taiwan and Tibet and potentially relinquish those territories as they move forward. So that would be something to maybe see in your lifetime. So that is our China unit. For the remainder of class, I would suggest working on your study guide to prepare for our upcoming test.